The New Testament lesson is from the Gospel of Luke, the 9th chapter, beginning at verse 28, which is Luke's account of the Transfiguration. Now, about 8 days after these sayings where Jesus was talking about death and resurrection, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to Jesus. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them. They were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen," or "my beloved. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. The word of the Lord. I may have mentioned to you before that I find that I go on Facebook far less than I have gone on Facebook previously. In large part, I go on Facebook. First, I don't have a lot of time to do that, but second, there is so much political garbage and hatred on Facebook. And what I find most disappointing and even offensive is that much of the garbage and hatred that is found on Facebook is put there by people I know go to church on Sundays. Just so we're clear on all this, church stuff is supposed to stay with us Monday through Saturday also. And while I'm on this little bit of a rant, I think I can also change that statement. You know, that you can tell a lot about a person by looking at 2 things. You can look at their checkbook and you look at their calendar. 2 other things I would add. You can tell a lot about a person by the way they drive. And in the mile from our house here this morning, I saw evidence of kindness and also stupid in 1 mile. 1 mile today. You can tell a lot about people by the way they drive, and you can tell a lot about people by what they post on Facebook. That's it for the Facebook ranting. But a couple of years ago, Facebook in many ways, not with the garbage, not with the hatred, but Facebook can be wonderful for sermon illustrations. And I found one there a couple of years ago. Someone posted something about the Transfiguration, and because of the timing, it was right around the Super Bowl at that time of year. And they're talking about the Transfiguration of Jesus and about his clothing becoming dazzling white. And they said this was a commercial for Tide. It's a Tide ad. Get your clothes so bright. And people talk about the consumer nature of the church. I don't know how many sermons you've heard on the Transfiguration. I don't know how many sermons I have preached on the Transfiguration. But it comes up in the lectionary every year. And I have to confess, there have been times I have done sermon series leading up to Lent, in part just so I don't have to preach another sermon on the Transfiguration. But when I did preach on the transfiguration, I've talked about Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, speaking to Jesus, about Peter's reaction of wanting to freeze the moment and stay there forever, about the voice from heaven saying, "This is my son, the beloved one, my chosen one, listen to him." And in some ways, I feel I've preached enough on the transfiguration. But I probably have one opportunity to preach one sermon on the topic of the transfiguration while I'm here at Camp Hill. So I'm going to take that opportunity. But the other reason I thought I want to preach on this text is that while I was again reading through this text from Luke's Gospel, we have an account of the transfiguration, by the way, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are not all the same. I found something in this reading from Luke that I'd never seen there before. It's found only in Luke. Peter, James, and John, those usual three who go with Jesus while the others aren't with Jesus in certain situations, they kind of dozed off while all this was happening, if you can imagine that. I mean, Moses and Elijah are there with Jesus. Wow! And they say, "I think I'll take a nap." But listen to what the text says. They were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who were with him. They saw his glory. Those words are not in Matthew. Those words are not in Mark. And I don't ever remember seeing them in that passage before. But when I saw that, my mind went right to the Gospel of John. In those words that we usually hear at Christmas time. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of glory and truth, full of grace and truth, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father. They saw his glory. We have seen his glory. And I don't think the disciples understood what they saw. And in many ways, we have not understood what we have seen. Not only that, I think there are many times we give indication that we're really not all that interested in trying to understand what we have seen. Like the disciples, we miss the point. Sometimes without knowing it, and sometimes perhaps intentionally. Look at Peter's response to what happened that day, to what he saw. "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings. Let us make a monument to this auspicious occasion. Let us freeze this as a moment in time and just bask in it forever. Maybe even stay here forever." And like many of us tend to think on certain occasions, let us stay on the mountaintop. Let us bask in the mountaintop experience forever. As I was preparing this sermon this week, I was also putting together the bulletin for the service on Wednesday night, for Ash Wednesday. One of the hymns that we will sing, the hymn at the close of the service on Wednesday night, is "In the cross of Christ I glory." Now, when we think about glory, maybe we think about Jesus on that mountaintop, or maybe we think about the great mystery of the incarnation. We think in terms of power and being on the mountaintop and victory. We think in terms of celebration and majesty, and again, we want to keep things right there, just the way we want them. You You may have said this about other situations and occasions. I wish I could hold on to this feeling forever. Or I wish this day never had to end. In the cross of Christ, I glory. I'm not sure that's how we usually think. Peter, James, and John, Peter being the spokesperson, saw this amazing scene before them, and they did recognize that it was amazing. Dazzling white appearance. Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. I do wonder, how did they know it was Moses and Elijah? Were they wearing name tags? Hello, my name is Moses. But the disciples wanted to stay there. They wanted to stay there. But the conversation with Moses and Elijah, according to Luke, was about Jesus' departure. And it's fascinating. The Greek word for departure or leaving is exodos. Now, granted, the disciples were in the middle of the journey. They had no clue where the journey was leading, but they knew where they wanted it to lead. They knew what they wanted it to mean. And they wanted it to be, and they wanted it to mean anything but a cross. They wanted the glory of the moment to be that which would elevate their thoughts and their spirits with excitement and with joy and with grandeur, to be the greatest of all feel-good times. And they wanted more to celebrate things like the miracles that they had seen, the way Jesus healed the leper or the paralytic or the man with the withered hand, or how he healed the centurion's servant without even being near that servant. He even raised the son of that widow at Nain. And that was good stuff. It was great stuff. And now on the mountain, they see this glory. Can it get any better than this? Did you watch the beginning of the Oscars last Sunday night? Adam Lambert did a fantastic job with the song "We Are the Champions" by Queen. And I think in many ways that is the image that so many people want to have of Jesus. The champion, the conqueror. No time for losers, for we are the champions of the world. And that's what a lot of people want in a Messiah. That may be the way we think it should be. And we want to try to set those terms. But look again at the words that we use as the assurance of pardon this morning. From the first chapter of 1 Corinthians. The cross is a stumbling block. The Greek word there is scandalon. Scandal. Cross is a scandal to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. It doesn't fit the way people think. And then in the second chapter of that letter, Paul says, I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Champion. Crucified. Glory. Cross. Some of that just doesn't fit together, especially in our contemporary "we are the champions" mentality. Staying on the mountain to celebrate a particular glory was what the disciples wanted to do. Coming down from the mountain and going to a cross would not at all fit their concept of glory. But Jesus' ministry was not a mountaintop type of ministry. Think again about that incarnational passage from the Gospel of John. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Full of grace and truth, we have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, pitched his tent in our midst, moved into the neighborhood. The Word became flesh and came into this world where we live in order to be with us in this life and through this life. This life is filled with some incredibly wonderful and powerful moments. This life is also filled with some really tragic and difficult things. This life is filled with divisions and separations and people being nasty to one another and treating others in a way that no one should ever be treated. And sometimes the people who are doing the nasty, making the nasty statements or doing the nasty things are people who claim to be religious and who go to church on Sundays. Things happen in this life that are terribly painful, that threaten to undo us. And the Word became flesh and entered into that life, into that kind of world. Not to make it all better, not to prevent any bad things from ever happening to anybody, but to be with us, to strengthen us, and to sustain us as we go through all those things in life. In Philippians, Paul tells us that Jesus emptied himself, took on human form, and became a servant. There again, glory and servanthood do not usually go together. And that's not what glory and servanthood, that's what we find in Jesus. Being found in human form, he became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Peter and James and John did not see that day on the mountaintop, and they had no concept of that, and it would not have entered their mind to even think that way, even though Jesus had told them about that. But they saw a particular kind of glory, very powerful in its own way, but that had been the only glory they wanted to see. And they, and all of us, if we limit glory just to that mountaintop, would have missed out on something far greater and far more wonderful and far more glorious. So often we are willing to settle for less than what is best, even if what we settle for is something really, really good. That day on the mountain was maybe as good as the disciples thought it could ever be. But there would be even more. They saw his glory on the mountaintop. And they wanted to keep it there, freeze it there, make a monument there, and stay there forever. But we know of an even greater glory than what was there on that mountaintop that day. The glory seen on a cross, where such love and sorrow meet, where thorns compose so rich a crown. A stumbling block. Foolishness. Not something we might even think we want. A suffering Messiah? but glory. Oh, the glory that is known only in the cross, only in Christ Jesus and Him crucified. Amen.